Today's webinar is entitled Supply Chain Triage, Issues to Consider in a Global Pandemic, and is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. I'm Todd Schwartz, Executive Director of the Cincinnati chapter of the EACC, and I'll be your moderator today. Now, we have over 200 registrants for today's event from China, France, Germany, Ireland, Israel, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Slovenia, Spain, the UK, the US, and even Venezuela. So I'm sure that we'll have a vibrant transatlantic and international discussion. Now, we've got a lot of material to discuss today. You've already seen the bios for our speakers, so I'm going to dispense with formal introductions, and we're going to get right into it. So I'm going to turn first to Laura Rabinowitz. Now, you're a partner at Greenberg Traurig in New York. You focus on supply chain issues. Why don't you kick us off with a brief overview of how the pandemic is impacting supply chains?
Okay, thank you so much, Todd, and welcome everyone. Hope everyone is safe and well. So the short answer to your question is the pandemic has created enormous supply chain disruptions. I mean, we started, I should say disruptions, I mean, tremendous difficulties. It started, when China was shutting down, and the question was, could raw materials and components get to the factories in China? For example, could Italian fabric get from Italy to China to be made into apparel at a Chinese factory? And the conversation moved very quickly from that to now the Italian factories are shut down. And then, there was complete shutdown of Chinese factories and Italian factories. So the conversation went from our factories, and from a US perspective also, our factories producing and at what levels are they producing? So we were, in February, we were reviewing supply chain agreements. What happens when orders aren't fulfilled? Who's going to bear, who's going to take the loss? And by the middle of March, once, Europe had shut down and the United States had shut down, supply chains were just, difficulty, it would be an understatement. Supply chains were just completely turned upside down. There were massive cancellation of orders. US buyers, wholesale, retail were just completely canceling orders. In many instances, I heard some purchasers were not paying for orders that had already been placed and had already been received. Certainly anything that was not on the water was being canceled. So very, very difficult time for, needless to say, for everyone along the supply chain. So it would just so quickly move from our factories producing at what levels to complete shutdown. And, and from that, looking at supply chain agreements to there are just no more orders. They're just, wholesale being canceled. And then as the pandemic spread and supply and demand shifted, some factories, started working. Most were left idle, and other factories then were starting to ramp up depending on what industry they were in. We've heard the auto industry is shut down, but in the food industry, they're working now 24-hour shifts. I work with some companies that, never had 24-hour shifts, and they're now working 24 hours, and they've had to reconfigure the factory floor so that it's safe for the workers there. Companies also have shifted what they're producing. I work with a company who manufactures plastic packaging for the cosmetics industry, and they're now manufacturing plastic face masks. So, completely supply and demand during the pandemic has really shifted. And then we've also heard that Louis Vuitton is now making masks. So maybe that's a side benefit of the pandemic. Once we venture out of our homes, we can get a Louis Vuitton mask. In any case, from a U.S. customs perspective, there was a fear, and I'm sure the other panelists will want to comment on this too, but there was a fear when the pandemic started that U.S. ports might shut down. The president in a press conference sort of mentioned about the stoppage of goods, but that was rolled back, and fortunately that didn't happen. The ports seem to be in the U.S. are functioning normally. There are not increased detentions or increased documentation for imports. So in any case, that's the U.S. perspective. Thank you, Tom.
It's just fascinating to consider the implications of this. And of course, again, just the implications alone could take a couple minutes, far more time to explain. But let's make sure we move on because we want to talk about how do we deal with this. So Stan de Callaway, you're the Senior Manager for Supply Chain Solutions with the Holland International Distribution Council. So now that we've heard about how the impact is impacting supply chains, why don't you take it from there? So how are companies and markets reacting to and working around these impacts?
Yeah, so thank you, Todd. And what Laura is mentioning about the shutting down of factories, we've seen pretty much the same in Europe. And there's different forces that are interrupting supply chains right now. And in my daily business, where I advise US companies with their supply chain setup in Europe, we get a lot of questions from US companies well, especially in the first few weeks, we got a lot of those. They were asking, should we worry about the continuity of logistics in Europe? Because it's shut down in such a magnificent, unprecedented way. Should we worry about our goods reaching their final destination? And I think the simple answer is yes, you can always worry about that. It is good to worry because then you make a lot of different plans. But a longer answer would be that no, it's not necessary right now to be very worried about that. In the Netherlands, for example, where I am based, but in a lot of, I think in all European Union countries, the logistics industry is designated a vital process, meaning that it should continue in any case. So we got a lot of questions from companies, okay, now at this point everything is functioning, but what if there will be a more significant lockdown? So far, there's no reason to believe the lockdown in countries will be stricter. They rather be relaxed. So I think in terms of strictness, we've had the worst already, which is pretty good news, I would say. And there hasn't been a moment in the last few weeks where we thought, okay, supply chains are really going to suffer right now in terms of continuity. Of course, there's a lot of nodes in the network that need to maintain function. So the ports, the airports, the inland terminals, they all need to continue function in times of social distancing. So these organizations, they have applied a lot of different measures to make sure they can continue work. Same goes for road freight. Of course, when the product comes into Europe, into a port, and then is loaded into a truck, these trucks need to be able to go cross-border as well. So the European Union, maybe a little bit late, but they have asked the member states to put down green lanes at the borders because there were a lot of waiting times when member states were checking traffic at the borders because personal traffic in a lot of cases is not allowed while road traffic should pass. So designated lanes are being installed right now. The first is actually between Belgium and the Netherlands, and waiting times have decreased. The Port of Rotterdam is fully functioning. Amsterdam Airport, it's not fully functioning because there's a 90% less passenger freight or passenger traffic, but there's a 40% increase of freighter traffic. So compared to a month ago, there's now 40% more freighters coming in. And it's passenger planes that they stuff full of protective gear, for example. Airlines are becoming very creative, but of course the whole cluster around the airport should be ready to handle and transport those goods to where they are needed. A lot of companies thought that distribution centers could be an issue. Not so much. In the Netherlands, a couple of weeks ago, we had a very high sick rate, especially because people were afraid of coming to work. But that had laid off, and now we're actually at the normal sick rate level. So all of the distribution centers across Western Europe are fully functioning. I think the biggest challenge is the delivery points. So where do the products go? We see that a lot of industrial plants, automotive factories, Laura talked about, they are shut down. So it's always important to call ahead. Are you open? Otherwise you are stuck before a closed door. So I think that's one of the main risks that there is now. Of course, there's challenges for supply chain managers. There's very long transit times currently from China. So also US companies source a lot of from China to Europe. So it can take a lot longer. There's lower frequency. They steam, so they sail a lot slower, the vessels, to be more economical. If you look at air freight, there's just really a capacity constraint currently. So you see huge rates increase in the market right now. So I think that the fear that it is halted supply chains should not be there, but there's a lot of work being done by the logistics industry to keep things moving. So that's where I wanted to give it over to Wim. Wim works for the Port of Antwerp. So I'm really curious, Wim, how do you perceive the continuity at the Port of Antwerp and everything that comes after?
Okay, on my behalf, good afternoon. I'm in Antwerp, so it's Europe time here. Welcome to all participants. I agree, Stan. In fact, one of the first things that had to be done is to define ports and hubs and the transport sector in the whole as a critical function. And I think that's what exactly happened in the European Union. So from that perspective, I think the right decision had been taken, like I imagine in most of the world. But looking at that critical function, it is self-evident that in these times, it's crucial to get the essentials, the bare essentials, down to the consumers, food, beverages, pharmaceutical products, medical supplies, and the likes. So it's absolutely not necessary to keep ports and hubs and transport sector going. The Port of Antwerp is in that respect, a very strong port on the transatlantic route. And in fact, also fulfills that large function of a gate from US products to the European Union and vice versa. So I'm happy to say that the Port of Antwerp also is fully operational. I think we will touch that in a later stage during this conversation. Also, what you mentioned with regard to the green lanes is extremely important. I think basically there's a very practical tool that I advise everybody to consult from time to time. It's a website called COVID-19.sixfold.com, in which you can see what the border crossing delay times are actually in Europe. And I looked at it earlier this morning, and basically there are no substantial delays in Europe, with the exception of Switzerland and Czechia. There are at the borders of Czechia and Switzerland, notably some delays that can go up to 6 hours or more. But other than that, I think things are being taken care of very well. There are, let's say, countries that have closed their borders for personal traffic, but not for cargo traffic. So that is crucial to secure the supply chain. I also want to refer very briefly to a recent study of IAPH, the International Associations of Ports and Harbors, who conducted a survey and is going to monitor that on a weekly basis. And the result yesterday, and the result refers to over close to 70 ports that have been conducting or participating in this survey. Worldwide, 50% roughly of these ports are in Europe, the rest in the United States, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and so forth. And this survey showed that basically for truck, 76% of the truck traffic runs very smoothly without any delay or notable delay whatsoever. For rail, and I think that's definitely the case in Europe, rail 80% runs very smoothly. Only a few exceptions where there are some more important delays, but 80% without substantial delays. And for barge traffic, Antwerp, like Rotterdam, is a port that relies very heavily on inland navigation. 92% runs smoothly. So I think these are figures that say a lot. And in these difficult times, basically the result is that supply chains keep on going for as far as they are active, of course.
Thank you very much, Wim. And I received a question about that website you mentioned. I can confirm that it's covid-19.sixfold.com. It's a great
Indeed.
website that uses mobile data to see actual waiting times at the border. So thank you. I want to go over to DJ. DJ, can you explain a little bit on the challenges in the US and the rest of the world?
Yes, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you are in Europe. Yes, as everybody said, the global supply chain has been deeply disrupted. It started when China started to shut down. And basically what this triggered is a huge change in ship rotations around the world, blank sailings, longer transit time, port skipping, and at the very beginning of the crisis, actually, pretty much all Chinese ports were skipped to begin with. Then, when China reopened, then the contrary happened. You know, Chinese ports reopened, and there was like this outflow of goods trying to get out of China when American companies and European companies were not ready to accept any cargo anymore. So the end result of that is not only you have a disruption in ship schedules across the world, but you also have a huge disruption in container fleets. And that's something that a lot of people tend not to take into consideration, but a lot of the equipment is in the wrong place today. And what happened as a Chinese crisis at the beginning when China was shut down rapidly had an effect in Europe because of this equipment disruption. For example, there was a huge shortage of containers in America because nothing was coming from China. Therefore, steamship lines cannot return the equipment to Europe for export cargo bound to Europe when at the time the flows between USA and Europe were still open. So this created a huge mess, and still a huge mess. Plus, you had contamination on some ships where crews were sick, vessels were denied access to some ports. All this adding to the problem. On the air freight side, the market pretty much shut down overnight when all airlines started to stop operating passenger flights pretty much worldwide, leaving us only with pretty much only cargo capacity. This triggered a huge spike in air freight rates. As an example, prior to crisis, China to New York freight rate was around $3 a kilo. Right now it's around $10 a kilo. Same thing for European freight. We have seen rates going from about €1.50 a kilo, €1.50 a kilo from pretty much anywhere in Europe to the East Coast, now jumping to €6 a kilo. So there has been tremendous disruption in the logistics world in terms of transportation, both air and ocean so far.
Okay, thank you, DJ. And I think it's good to know that for Europe, there's alternatives to the very unpredictable and long transit times that we see now of vessels not using the Suez Canal, for example, but taking the long route around Africa. It's like we're going hundreds of years back into history, but that is actually happening. You can take a train, and we see that the train from China to Europe actually has had his best month in history in March. So that's interesting. So that's what we wanted to say about logistics continuity. And of course, we have time at the end to answer any questions. Leave them in the chat box. And now I want to give it back to Todd.
So we've heard a little bit about some of the challenges. We've heard about how the markets and how the logistics companies are responding to that. Let's talk about trade policy, because of course that's one of the most important factors in determining what your supply chain looks like. There's been a lot of changes recently in trade policy. Laura, let's come back to you. Tell us a little bit about how governments are reacting and adjusting trade policy in response to this pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. So first, from the US perspective, this administration has been very aggressive with the use of tariffs as a negotiating tool, pre-pandemic, I'm talking. And the administration has a stated goal of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. So, you know, in July of 2018, pre-pandemic, the administration instituted additional tariffs on products from China and from the EU. And this is on top of the general rate of duty, which is already in place for imported products. So to date, the US has collected $49.6 billion on products from China, additional duties. This started in July of 2018, where the United States imposed 25% additional duty. They're in 3 different tranches rolled out. In 3 different, and the 4th tranche started in September of 2019 at 15%. That was reduced to 7.5% in February of 2020, pursuant to the Phase 1 agreement between the United States and China. So importers into the US of components, raw materials, and finished products from China have been dealing with basically, 25% or now 7.5% additional tariffs, and have been struggling to mitigate that additional tariff burden for a while, since July of 2018. There is an exclusion process for each list, for each tranche. That has now finished, where importers were able to request a specific exclusion for specific products, and those are good for 1 year. Very difficult to get extensions. And then for products imported into the US from the EU, there's been a long-running dispute between the US and the EU at the WTO over subsidies to Airbus. And then finally, based on a WTO decision, the United States, the US Trade Representative, imposed additional tariffs on specific products from the EU at 25% additional duty, and aircraft at 15% additional duty. And the United States Trade Representative has said that they may revise those percentages depending on actions of the EU. Now, those lists are country-specific and product-specific, so it's very important for importers to review those lists. And those lists contain all the good things that the US imports from Europe: cheese and fruit, meat, olives, scotch, Irish whiskey, coffee. So anyway, so that's all pre-pandemic. That's okay. By the fall of that's by the fall of 2019. That's the backdrop to the pandemic. Now we see the intersection of US trade policy and the pandemic, where this administration has a view that the US has a strategic vulnerability because we're not manufacturing enough in the United States, and specifically certain products in the United States. And I would say there's bipartisan support for the idea of bringing supply chains back to the United States. And we're tracking that, and we're going to see what happens. I think right now Congress is in crisis mode, but once things calm down a bit, we do expect bipartisan legislation to bring supply chains back to the U.S. The U.S. Trade Representative is accepting applications for exclusions for specific medical products coming from China. That process is in place till the end of June, and they're rolling out those decisions as well. In terms of exports, the U.S. just put in place export controls on medical supplies. They now need authorization from FEMA prior to export, and other countries have done that as well across the globe. China and 70 other countries around the world, I've read 70, have put in export controls for the export of medical equipment and other medical supplies. So that's sort of the intersection of trade policy and the pandemic from a US and a global perspective.
Stan, do you want to take a minute and just talk about from the European perspective?
Yeah, just real briefly, I think the European Union has also seen that it is one of the most effective or most logical ways to deal with this pandemic is making it as easy as possible to import protective gear. So we see that the duties have been eliminated for this category. And the customs authorities in the Netherlands, they have imposed additional measures, such as the postponement of duty payments for entrepreneurs. So just to keep their cash flow in better perspective. And their filings, they can be postponed as well, so they can focus on more important things. So it's just a couple of, well, it's seemingly small things, but they want to keep the pressure on importers as low as possible.
That's interesting, Stan. In the United States, we have not seen that. In fact, from products from China, there was a sort of a tease, and we were waiting to see whether customs would delay duty payments in general, and also specifically on products from China, similar to what the IRS has done with tax payments here by delaying them for 90 days, and the administration determined not to do that. So those duties are fully in place and expected at time of entry.
Trade policy, one of my favorite topics, just so exciting, but extraordinarily important. So we have, I think we have a really good picture of where we are right now. But of course, for the folks on the call, their company is not going to survive right now. Their company is going to survive, or it's going to thrive, or it's going to fail in the future. So let's turn to that now. Wim, you're the International Development Manager for the Antwerp Port Authority. Your job is to help companies. So give us some perspective here. Let's now turn our view to the future. What does all this mean for the future of global supply chain management?
I do think that post-COVID-19, and there will be a time that we come out of this mess, I'm sure, but things will look very different than they were before. So if we return what we say back to normal, I think it will be a different normal. That is for sure. But I think I would like to highlight what the Port Authority, because that's the company I'm representing, what we do to, let's say, to support the business. And I told you that our first and only focus today is to keep the port operational, to make supply chains work, whatever supply chains there are, intra-European, intra-continental, international trade needs to be secured. In that respect, I think it's important to know that the Port of Antwerp created very quickly at the beginning of the outbreak a task force which is, let's say, composed of all the actors, all the stakeholders in the nautical and the logistical chain. So we have quite a complicated logistic chain. It's not only different actors in the nautical part, but even cross-border. There's a shared command of the pilot function between the Netherlands and Belgium, for instance. So it was extremely important to compose, let's say, an efficient task force that monitors the situation day to day. I think that's key. You have to make sure that you keep on track of all the developments and jointly agree on possible measures to be taken. And that is what happens today. We have defined fallback positions, how to secure operationability of the port and the different ports in the Scheldt basin. We have defined a uniform and transparent communication system, because it's extremely important that all the actors have the noses in the same direction. And I think from that perspective, it's extremely important that you keep the finger on the pulse continuously. Port specific, I can tell you that we have secured the, let's say, the the arrival of incoming vessels, the procedure is very clear and follows a certain set of rules. Up till now, the Port of Antwerp has not had a single case of, let's say, a refused vessel. All vessels, and we're for the first quarter, we even noticed an increase of a substantial increase of traffic, plus 4%, which is not non-neglectable. So in that respect, we did everything what we could as a port authority to, together with all the other stakeholders, including customs, food agency, pilots, tugboats, etc., to secure that vital chain. Also to the hinterland. And we have jointly agreed on the measures that need to be taken with regard to social distancing, hygienic measures, and so forth. The cleaning of equipment on the terminals after a shift has been done. Everything is being taken care of, and up till now, things keep on up and running. Does that answer your question a little bit, Todd?
Got to get there. Yeah, no, I think that helps, but I mean, I think there's other things here to talk about in terms of diversification of supply chains and so forth. I mean, did any of the other panelists, Didier, did you want to have some comment on here?
Yes, absolutely. I think the global supply chain is going to be totally transformed in the years to come. This transformation actually started even before COVID-19 started. I would even dare to say probably started even before the trade war started. Companies realized a few years back that they were overexposed with China, and of course their fears have proven to be correct. And first the trade war, then the COVID-19 resulted in a very big change of attitude of the importers about diversifying the supply chain. And this is proven for companies to be a lot more complicated than they probably initially thought. Because changing your supply chain is not as easy as finding a new supplier somewhere else in the world, moving your production from China to Vietnam, or from China to Thailand, or from China to India. It's far more complicated than that. For example, we have a very large customer in the United States who moves tens of thousands of containers a year from China, and he decided to move a big portion of his production to Vietnam. They found suppliers, they placed orders, and then they realized when they finally sent their head of logistics to Vietnam that he was very, very surprised to see that the port of Hanoi was very under-equipped, for example, compared to Ningbo. So when people are looking at changing their supply chain, very often they miss the point of looking upstream of what are the local challenges on the ground wherever they want to diversify. And infrastructure is one of the big problems to diversify supply chain. I mean, for example, if you take India, you have huge power outages, roads are terrible, you have terrible congestion, and it's very, very difficult to overnight change your supply chain. Though it's going to change, but I believe it's going to take a long time. In addition to that, the global supply chain today, we can call it a China supply chain, because even when you want to diversify your supply chain from China to another Southeast Asia country, you realize very, very quickly that your new supplier in Thailand or in Cambodia or in Vietnam is himself supplying himself from China. So when you think you have solved your problem buying somewhere else, you realize that the bottlenecks of China still exist. And that is why, though, there is going to be a very, very profound change in the supply chain, in my opinion, in the years to come, because people want to get a closer supply chain and people want to have a more diversified supply chain. It's still going to take them a lot more time and planning than they initially thought. Back to you, Todd.
If I may add to that, Todd, I completely agree with DJ that the reverse globalization trend has been something that we've seen for quite a while. And I think it will definitely accelerate because of what's happening now. And I think there's a couple of factors that are into play here. First, you have the pull factors that I would say that would pull supply chains closer to where the product needs to be, which is that a lot of products, and especially consumer products, but also industrial products, they have shorter life cycles. So you need to get them to market more quickly. And it's important to have short lead times. So you want to manufacture close to your market, and when it's closer physically, geographically, then there's also less risk of disruption. Another reason to have what we would call nearshoring or reshoring, so bringing the production closer to the market, and that's definitely something that we've seen in Europe, is that you want to be flexible. So you want to be able to adjust to the demand as quickly as possible. And if your supply chains are so long, that's simply very, very difficult to do. You have to be a star in projections and planning. So we've seen a lot of companies that brought back their production, not just for rates, because that of course is important as well. And we've seen it in the US that duties are a big driver for reshoring. In Europe, we have not seen that yet, but that's also something that could come into play because we don't know what the post-corona world would look like. There are things going on right now that could put China in a certain spot where other economic blocs say, okay, we want to make trading with China more difficult or something like that. So you have those forces. Then, of course, you have technological advance like automation, where you don't need as many hands like blue-collar workers in a manufacturing process. So if you get that cost factor out of the process, then the geographical location becomes less important for that aspect as well. Another thing I would say that a lot of companies are reluctant to, and I like the term China supply chains or China-focused supply chains. There's always the worry about IP protection, and that comes into play as well for companies when they decide in the boardrooms in 6 months where they're going to build their next factory. So yes, it's going to be more regionalization. I think that will be more the norm than globalization, which could become an exception.
Well, Said, you raise a really good point, and of course, you know, the intersection again of trade policy and business activity. You touched on duties and so forth. I mean, Laura, you know, the American president, of course, has put a lot of time and effort into encouraging companies to reshore operations, bring manufacturing back to the U.S. I mean, does this just bolster his argument?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to say that I agree, as Didier and Stan were discussing, that you know, diversification of supply chains was in effect. Companies were trying to do that, trying not to be 100% in China pre-pandemic. They realized that that was not good for their supply chains to be so dependent on China. So companies were trying, and they were trying to move to other countries, specifically in Asia. But the issue is the capacity in the other Asian factories. I mean, China just has the numbers, the workforce, the skills for certain products. So I think as supply chains try to become more nimble, which it's not easy for supply chains to be nimble and to get factories certified, particularly if they're, you know, any regulated products, if it's a, you know, a medical device or food. I mean, there's children's products. I mean, there's a lot of certifications that have to take place, and just that retraining of the workforce. So I think companies and countries are going to try to do that. You know, but as Didier pointed out, I mean, the issues with logistics when you're in Vietnam or Thailand, the ports are just not set up as the China ports are, and the factories just don't have the capacity. But I think there is a push for that, certainly diversification. And then from a US perspective, there is going to be a tremendous push to bring back manufacturing here. But again, we're going to have the workforce issue. I think there's going to have to be a lot of training. And we don't have, right now, we don't have the workforce to work in those factories and to do this. I mean, I read that ventilators have up to 900 components. So I think it would be, I don't know, nearly impossible for the United States to source every component just from the United States to make a ventilator. So I think supply chains, certainly in the short term, will continue to be global, despite this US push to increase manufacturing in this country.
Pim, you wanted to react to that.
I think I agree with Laura. Basically, I don't personally believe in a complete change in a short-term period. I think it is true to say that globalization, perhaps that the balance went completely the extreme way and is now going to turn back. But I personally am not convinced that we will see a complete change for local production. I think simply one of the reasons is that it's not possible. There are a number of things that you have to source from other countries as well. That being said, I think that it will be a combination of both. And in fact, what was important to remember, as I heard from Didier, is that supply chains are destined to become more complex because far too much we have been focusing on single sourcing, one single supply chain for the simplicity of things, and it turns out that long supply chains are very vulnerable in times like these, and you need to protect yourself against that. Ergo, that means that you will have multiple sourcing, a focus on multiple sourcing, and that makes supply chain more complex. And in that respect, I think we may see a new normal, but it will not be a complete return to local production for local consumption. I think that is not realistic to think it will turn out that way. Other than that, I think there are a lot of other changes that may be expected in the future that fundamentally will change the supply chain. Not in the least, further digitalization, automatization, robotization will also help design and re-engineer supply chain on a global scale. Todd?
Well, we could go on and on and on just on some of these topics, but I want to make sure that we have opportunities to answer the questions from our audience who've been listening and sending comments in. And I'm going to start with one that of particular interest to me. Didier, I want to come to you. I'm trained as an economist. I'm always interested in how impacts in one market drive changes in other markets. So I want to come to you just with the first question. How do you see the spike in air freight rates? How is that going to impact ocean freight rates and other transportation mode pricing in the coming months and years?
Thanks, Todd. Very good question, actually. What I think is going to happen, we're going to have a major shift in mode of transportation coming forward. I see that ocean freight could become a major benefiter of the crisis in the long term. The reason being is, as we have seen, air freight rates have gone through the roof because of lack of capacity. And as the economy is going to reopen, it's very, very likely that air freight routes will not reopen as fast as the economy. It's going to take longer for flights to resume because people will still be scared of traveling, because airlines will not be able to afford to reopen routes immediately because they are basically all virtually bankrupt right now. So, and they will need the income for air freight also to sustain themselves. So I think air freight is very, very likely in the short term and also the midterm to remain a very premium product with very expensive air freight rates. And this might benefit ocean business, especially since more carriers are putting on the market premium ocean service with shorter transit time, with more efficient port handling operations, which also shorten the lead time to get your ocean freight. So I think there's going to be a bigger gap between air and ocean freight in the future. Also, bear in mind that air freight is not a primary revenue source for an airline. It's secondary revenue source. Everything is detected by the airline by the yield on the passenger revenue, not by the cargo. So if the passengers are not there, the flights are not going to resume, and therefore the rates, the shortage of capacity will remain and the rates will remain very high. And I think this is what importers and exporters really need to brace themselves for, some very, very tense air freight market in the future with very, very high air freight rates. In addition to that, this crisis has shown that on the supply chain, a lot of companies didn't have enough level of inventory control. I mean, for example, I think Apple had 12 days of inventory for iPhones. And they really quickly realized that was not enough. And a lot of companies had very low level of inventories because China shut down first and America didn't. And they were running out of products in the US. So I think also people will learn to have more inventories, a bigger buffer, which is also going to benefit ocean freight because people will be capable of waiting longer to get their orders in. So I think ocean freight is poised to do very well, whereas air freight is very likely to become a premium product.
Fascinating. And just watching them take the seats out of airliners to convert them to freighters, it's just, again, a lesson in modern economics. Let me come to you with a question, Laura. Francis Jan writes, do we really think that moving from China to other countries in Asia will fix the issue? What about European and USA manufacturing capacity? It would not only be social responsibility, but also a financially sound strategy. You touched on that, but maybe you want to dive into that just a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a really good question in terms of a company's social responsibility of where their products are manufactured. In fact, labor conditions and the importation of products made with forced or slave labor is a major issue for U.S. Customs right now. Even throughout the pandemic, they are moving forward with withhold release orders. Importers have to be really have to be working to have visibility into their supply chains. We discussed it's so difficult to move from factory to factory, and this is one of those issues that companies really need to review, audit, and it's a very difficult process to know what documentation you need to show U.S. Customs if they ever were to ask whether the products are, I mean, whether they're detaining your goods and want to know if the products were made with forced or slave labor. This is a very important issue to U.S. Customs right now, and there's support in Congress for this, and there's about to be legislation proposed on certain specific areas in China, whether products they were made with social responsibility. So that, I mean, is a very important issue when companies are thinking about moving from factory to factory, for sure.
Yeah, it's again interesting to see the interplay of all of these issues, economics and social responsibility and market preferences. It just, you know, hard to imagine how businesses are able to actually juggle all these things. Stan, let me come to you with a question. Richard Blackwell writes, to panelists at the end of the presentation, Japan recently announced that they will be providing $2 billion to companies to relocate from China to Japan, plus an additional amount to move production from China to other countries. Do you think more countries will follow suit given the vulnerability in the supply chain and dependence upon Chinese manufacturers? Does this provide an opportunity for Europe or the United States to attract some of these manufacturers?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and it was a bit of a shock when I read this in the news that Japan is actually subsidizing the move of manufacturing out of China, which is it could be a precedent for companies to or countries to follow suit, and it's also something that looked a bit familiar to me when we looked back a couple of years ago when the Brexit vote was done, and a lot of companies were looking into their supply chains in Europe, whether to start moving from the UK to be able to supply to the European market in a good way after Brexit. And the first companies actually that we got in touch with were the Japanese companies. So Japanese companies, they use the UK as a landing spot for a lot of their European entry. And they were the first ones to start looking into lower risk solutions. They are very risk averse. So it doesn't really surprise me that that this is something that they would start with. And it definitely brings opportunities for the US and the EU, because some of this manufacturing could move to their markets. So reshore to a place where the products eventually go, that could be definitely the case. Whether other countries are going to subsidize the actual move, I'm not sure. I would doubt it, but you know, weirder things have happened in recent times.
Pin the video. Okay, this is fascinating. Here's a question. Let's see. There's a question on, who had the question on digitalization? Let me throw this one out, Laura. Laura, again, back to the intersection of politics and trade policy. Do you think that this reverse globalization will continue if the Democrats win in November? You know, how do you think that's going to affect the process?
Yeah, I actually think no matter who is in the White House, you know, in the election, I think there's going to be a push in the U.S. for more domestic manufacturing. And I think, I don't think the tariffs on Chinese products, EU products, is just going to go away right away. Perhaps they'll be scaled back if it's a Democrat, but there's a lot of push in the Democratic Party, you know, particularly in states, you know, with unions. You know, the Congresswoman from Michigan has been very outspoken. But I think there's a big push to still stay tough with China. I don't think the tariffs are going to go right away, and I think there will be a push to increase manufacturing in the U.S.
Here's a question I want to throw to Didier. We talked a little bit about this. Talk to me a little bit more about digitalization as we move, you know, from paper and I mean, we've seen automation, but artificial intelligence, digitalization. How is that going to affect and support changes in the supply chain as we go forward?
Well, digitalization is going to be crucial, and we have seen it in the last months here already. I mean, one of the big reasons why the supply chain didn't shut down and ports stayed operational and everybody was able to keep moving is because of digitalization and electronic messaging and everything in EDI. And for example, in our company, we've been able to be totally functional by working remotely and transmitting information electronically to our partners, whereas it is an airline, a steamship line, or even US Customs. We were able to clear shipments electronically through US Customs. So digitalization is going to be a very, very, very important part, and we have seen it now. It was a key factor in remaining operational. In addition to that, as you see the disruption being on an unprecedented level, you can see that the flow of information is even more important than ever before, and all the actors of supply chain need to have complete visibility of their supply chain and their in-transit goods, for example. So it's not only tracking and tracing of your shipment, which is of course is important, but for the supply chain actors, it's also all the visibility on the complete supply chain, the PO management, the lead time, all the KPI for the product to come to the importers, and the importer's ability to predict how long it's going to take, and the information you can get from his partners on how disrupted it is, and the solution you can get from his partners. So digitalization, yes, will continue to be a major factor in the evolution of the supply chain, and has already proven in this crisis how important it is.
So Wim, here's a simple question for you. Can you talk about the ports in Germany? You've mentioned Antwerp and Rotterdam, but are the main German ports operating at more or less the same levels?
Indeed, I think when we put Antwerp or Rotterdam as examples, both Stan and myself, it goes without saying that German ports and other ports in Europe are practicing more or less the same kind of procedures. There's hardly any difference compared in how to approach. It may be slightly different from port to port, but the basic essential is that every authority tries to keep the port open and does whatever is necessary to comply with that in, let's say, the most transparent and communicative way. So I don't see any major difference in that respect with other ports in Northwest Europe or the Mediterranean side for that much. I think one of the things that, if you allow me to come back on the previous discussion, Todd, very briefly, but one of the things that we need to realize is that all of this, it's a COVID-19 seminar, all of this is going to have a huge impact on the economy itself. There is a substantial damage to the economy expected, and even more so the longer it takes before a solution is found. There will be huge job losses, there will be economic downfall. Everybody realizes that especially in the US and the EU, that we're going into a recession, and it will take a while to climb out of that recession. And that has an impact on the spending capability of the consumers and the investment capabilities of the businesses. And that is for a very long time going to have an impact, I'm afraid, to global economy. So it's very hard. We don't have a crystal ball what is going to happen, but we do have to realize that there is also a cost to nearshoring, relocating everything to the own country, if possible. It's going to have a huge impact on the consumers themselves. If Laura clearly states the impact of import duties on the US, it has an impact on American people and their consuming capabilities. So it's going to be a tough period ahead. And the more and the quicker we go to, let's say, we return to a more or less normal situation, the better it is, in my view.
Stan, you wanted to add something.
Yes, I think indeed the demand part of the supply chain is going to be an issue for the next months. Of course, we are in uncharted territory in the size of this crisis and this pandemic. But if you look at previous pandemics, then you could see that the economy tended to bounce back quite quickly. And if we see light at the end of the tunnel, so for example, we know that in half a year or in 8 months, we will have a vaccine, then confidence could come back and maybe we get a V-shape in the economic figures. So that's what I hope, but I am inherently a positive person. So I definitely hope that's going to be the case. In any case, we do see that some product categories and some types of business are doing really well. For example, e-commerce. We have been getting a lot of questions from US companies that see opportunities in times of social distancing. For example, in fitness equipment and food products. And definitely the e-commerce industry is doing really well currently. We do hear some issues about Amazon not being able to cope or only focusing on non-essential or on essential products. There is definitely opportunities to get product on the market today. And that's something, a positive note I wanted to end with.
Stan, and I think everybody appreciates the positive note. You know, we will get to a new normal, and a new normal will create new opportunities, and it'll be the companies that are prepared to envision and grasp those opportunities be the ones that come most successfully out of this crisis. So lots of other questions that we could answer, lots of other topics we could address, but our time is gone. I do want to say, just to say thanks. That concludes today's webinar entitled Supply Chain Triage, Issues to Consider in a Global Pandemic. Deep thanks to our panelists, Laura Siegel-Rabinowitz from Greenberg Traurig, Didier Van de Peer from Klasken, Stan de Calloway from the Holland International Distribution Council, and Wim Dillon of the Antwerp Port Authority for sharing your experience and your insight. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us in today's discussion. Just a reminder, please stay in touch with your local chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce for information on upcoming webinars and events. And be sure to look for a recording of this and other EACC webinars and events on our YouTube channel. Thanks again to everybody, and farewell.
Thank you.